Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you another wrap up. This time I'm talking thrillers, horror, and true crime because, well, I went down another rabbit hole. This time it was serial killers, both fictional and non-fiction. And yeah, I got really obsessed. It distracted me from all of my review copies, and I have a lot of good books to talk about, or at least interesting books. So if that sounds good to you, hopefully you stick around. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about When the Corn is Waist High by Jeremy Scott. This is a book that I received for review from Turner Publishing. And this book is set in the 1980s, and we follow a sheriff who is also the priest of a small Indiana town. And in the story, there is a murder that takes place, and soon enough there is another, and so they begin to wonder if there is a serial killer on the loose. Every time someone dies, they are left with a flower on their body, which seems to be the serial killer's signature. This story is told from the sheriff/priest perspective, and I have to say that this is the coziest serial killer novel that I have ever read. And at first I wasn't sure if it was for me, but when it got going, oh wow, did I get into it. So given the setting of this book, despite the fact that it is about a serial killer, this book feels very quaint and cozy. And so that is not something I normally pick up. I'm not drawn towards those cute little cozy mystery novels about the woman who runs a bookstore and has a bunch of cats and then solves mysteries in her spare time. That's never been my thing. You know me, I go for the dark and disturbing. But something about this book just really intrigued me. I'd seen some early good buzz, and I just had a feeling that it was going to be special. And when I picked it up, well, I'll say that it was really quaint and cozy. There was lots of discussions about small town life, the food they eat, the traditions, they're all going to church. And because the main perspective is not just the sheriff who's trying to solve these crimes, but also the priest, you get his religious leanings in there. So you get him going through and dealing with other people's confessions, talking about church and routines and faith. And again, it just felt very sentimental, very, again, small townish. It hit on all the cliches. And I'll be honest, partway through this book, I started to wonder maybe this book was a little bit too cute and cozy for me, but I stuck it out, and I'm really glad I did, because there are some plot twists and turns that I thought were really interesting. And I'll just say that the book got, really intriguing. And especially the second half, I just got glued to the page, and I just love seeing how it fell out. I don't want to say more about it. I hope I haven't said too much already. And if you haven't yet picked it up, I just recommend going in and not knowing too much more. So yeah, I recommend this one. It was a little bit different, but exactly what I needed at the time. Next, we have Zombie by Carol Joyce Oates. And this is a book that I knew was not about a zombie, but actually about a serial killer. I picked up this book because a lot of people have described it as one of the most disturbing books that they have ever read. And if you've been watching my recent reviews, you might notice that that's a little bit of a trend. I've been purposely seeking out those books. I've been reading a lot of lists online and scouring the internet for all of the most disturbing things that I can find. And I thought this one might be a new favorite. Unfortunately, it was not. The basic story follows a serial killer, particularly told from his perspective, and I usually like getting stories from that villainous perspective, but in this case, I just found the narrative to be very fragmented and not in a good way. Sometimes that can be really unsettling, but in this case, it just frustrated me. I felt like the book needed more editing, and it just pulled me out of the story because I found myself wanting to pull out a pen and kind of edit the book instead of getting immersed into the creepy narrative. So it didn't work for me, which is super disappointing. Not a serial killer book I can personally recommend, even though I know other people love this one. Now, switching over to true crime, I read a memoir called The Phantom Prince by Elizabeth Kendall, which is a pseudonym for Ted Bundy's girlfriend, or at least one of them, who was with him during the years of his killings. If you're not familiar, Ted Bundy, of course, is an infamous serial killer, and I'm gonna kind of skim over all of his crimes. You can look that up online for yourself if you don't know and are interested. But I was really interested in this story because for me, the appeal's the wrong word, but my fascination with Ted Bundy comes in from the fact that a lot of people said that he really passed as a quote-unquote normal person, and they really didn't see this evil side of him, that he was able to really hide it from the world. And so I really wanted to see the perspective of someone like her who lived very closely with him, who was intimate with him, who shared a lot of her own life, and just to see if she saw the cracks in the wall or if she really saw him as a normal person. The story is very open and honest. She wrote it not long after everything came to light, so she really admits it within the narrative that at the time of writing it, the first time, she was still quite raw. She really struggled with still having emotional feelings for him despite knowing intellectually everything that he had done. And I think I appreciate this book just because it was very open and she really did expose herself. And I will say that if you're going to check out this book, I highly recommend checking out an updated version, because the one that I read had a later afterword that was put in years later. And I think that that really helped, because she acknowledged that in her first writing of the book, which was not edited or changed in the final updated version, she definitely makes statements about him and kind of is a bit more forgiving of some of his nature than perhaps she should have been. And so years later, when she is fully sober, she really comes back to the book with a different light and is able to really call out Ted Bundy for the evil man that he was. And so I just think that if you're going to read that book, it's only fair to see her writing it much later on and getting her perspective years later. There's also a perspective from her daughter, who was not Ted Bundy's daughter, but a stepdaughter per se. And I thought that that perspective was really interesting and added a lot to the story, because she remembers a lot of her childhood living around Ted Bundy and is very revealing with some very personal, intimate details of just some uncomfortable and inappropriate behavior. So I really felt that the end of the book really was very sobering and just took away the persona of this prince in shining armor, and you really get to see the man that he actually was, which was not as glamorous as the media made him out to be. From there, I went on to read The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule, and this of course is the iconic true crime story that is written from the perspective of a true crime writer who ended up befriending Ted Bundy before she knew who he was, and she actually had the contract to write this book before it was revealed that he was behind it all. And so she fully admits that from a professional journalist standpoint, she was in an incredible position to get to be so intimately involved with this case. However, personally, of course, this was a huge struggle and really defined a lot of her life and career, and not necessarily in a good way. I will say that if you are a true crime junkie, if you are interested in Ted Bundy's case, it's definitely an iconic book that you should read, but I actually don't think it's one of the best true crime books I've personally read. I thought that the narrative was really bloated. I felt like she just included every single detail about Ted and their relationship and every conversation they ever had, and it just got to the point that it was so much detail that there was a lot of information that wasn't really pertinent or didn't really have a lot of meaning behind it. And so I would have preferred a more tight narrative. And I also think that she has a lot of personal bias, which is definitely shown in the text, and really doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on the victims. And she does, again, I read a version that was reprinted later with a new afterword, and so she gives kind of more light and respect to the victims, but it definitely still feels dated compared to a lot of the true crime books that I've been reading over the past few years. I do think that it shows when it was written, and if it was written today, it would have been done a little bit differently. But again, if you haven't read it, if you're fascinated by the case or just want to read all the true crime, this is definitely one that you should check out just because it is so famous. Then I read Ted Bundy, Conversations with a Killer, and this is another true crime book that was written shortly before he was executed. There were men that had the opportunity to interview him, and through their interviews, they got him to agree to discuss the cases that he was accused of in the third person perspective and to speculate what the killer may have done, what they would have experienced, and he agreed to do so. So this allowed him to talk about his crimes without actually legally implicating himself. And because of this, it made for a really interesting book. Now, to be clear, he is technically the entire book talking about, well, I think this person would have done this, I think he would have said this, but even within the conversations, because you're basically just reading transcripts within this book, and I highly recommend the audiobook version because so much of it is just, again, written word, but because of that, you get this really fascinating conversation where he keeps slipping up and almost saying I and me, and then he switches to, oh, well, I mean, that guy. And so it's really obvious that it's him, but he keeps up this persona that it's someone else. And I thought that it was so compelling. And of course, getting inside his mind, getting him to explain the ideas and reasoning behind all of his gruesome murders and everything that he did, everything that he denied, and so forth, was fascinating. Very, very disturbing, but also very fascinating. I am someone who is fascinated by criminal psychology, and so getting inside his mind was quite the experience. I highly recommend it if you can handle it. It's definitely one of the most disturbing books I've read in a long time. And I gotta say, because again, I did it on audio, I had this weird audiobook glitch on my phone where the audiobook would start to play at really random times. So I was in a conversation on Discord with my patrons, and all of a sudden the audiobook started playing, and I freaked out because I thought that this man was talking in my Discord group about murdering people. And I was like, who just popped into this voice chat? And it just kept doing that over and over again. I've never had that with an audiobook before or since, and I'm convinced that audiobook is just haunted or something. But highly recommend if you're fascinated by the case. This is definitely one you want to check out. It was so compelling, so gripping, and I could not put it down. But yeah, very disturbing subject matter. So all the content warnings with this and all the other Ted Bundy books that I talked about today. And I also read Unmasked by Paul Hohl. And if you're not familiar, he is quite iconic in the true crime field because he was involved in identifying and capturing the Golden State Killer. And if you're not familiar with that case, I highly recommend first reading I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, because this book references that, but I do think that you're going to get a lot more out of this book if you first read that one. And I gotta say that this one was very interesting. I enjoy the case. I was in the mood for true crime. I don't know if it's the most iconic, memorable book I've ever read. It sheds some new light on the Golden State Killer case, but if you're like me, after the case broke, I ended up listening to a bunch of podcasts, so it didn't really share a whole lot of new information that I didn't get from those other sources, but it was still interesting to go back and revisit it. You also get some other information on other cold cases that he was investigating, and then you also get information on Paul Hohl's personal life, and you find out that he was a huge workaholic and his marriage and relationship with his children really suffered because of that. I like how honest he was, and I'm not someone who minds a story that involves a lot of personal details about the author as well as the cases, so I didn't mind that, although I will say that I don't think his personal life was as interesting as other true crime writers, just simply because he just admitted that he had no life, so his personal story was that he had no personal story essentially. But overall, I definitely thought it was gripping, easy read, and I flew through it. So again, if you're a true crime fan, definitely one you'll want to check out. And this last book sort of fits into this video, but also really not. And I also received a review copy of My Mother's War, The Incredible True Story of How a Resistance Fighter Survived 3 Concentration Camps by Ava Taylor. And this is a true crime memoir that is about the survivor of concentration camps, as it suggests. So technically you could call the Nazi serial killers, I think, in a way, although in a very different perspective. But regardless, I am always interested in World War II, particularly Holocaust narrative. So I was interested in this one, even though it's a little bit outside of my normal genres. I will say that this one is very important in terms of, like, I always think it's important to tell every single Holocaust survivor's tale, but as a narrative, I didn't find this book to be overly compelling. It was compiled after the fact, with the daughter just going through the letters and then telling the story, and just the way it was written wasn't overly compelling, and I don't think it really did justice to the incredible strength and survivability of her mother. So I would say that the story behind this book is important, but the way it is told was a little bit lackluster, and I do think that there are better Holocaust survivor stories out there that do a better job of kind of illuminating the entire atrocity and everything that happened. But this is a new one if you're like me and kind of reading everything that's out there. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? I know this video was a little bit more heavy on true crime, but it's just the way it goes. I don't artificially curate these videos, but instead I really just talk about the books that I read over the last few weeks. And if I'm honest, I've been really obsessed with serial killer narratives, so that's what you got this time. All that being said, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, science fiction, fantasy, and apparently a lot of true crime, so I think that's going to stay on the channel for at least the next while. If you are already subscribed, thank you so much. You can help me out with a thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if just a little emoji like a smiley face or a knife. And if you want to help me out, you can hit that little notification bell so that you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.